Hello, everyone, and good morning, and welcome to this webinar. I'm David Weston. I'm the chairman of the Scottish Bed and Breakfast Association. Just to quickly introduce ourselves, we are the trade association for bed and breakfasts, guest houses, and small independent hotels. So the owner-managed sector of service accommodation in Scotland. We're members of the Scottish Tourism Alliance, and we're affiliated with the UK Bed and Breakfast Association, which has been established for 16 years, and is a member of the UK Tourism Alliance. And through that, I sit on the UK Tourism Industry Council. As a trade association, we're here to inform, support and represent our members. And just as an example, briefly, this Monday, we've been talking to Scottish Government officials about future plans for a visitor levy or tourist tax, which may happen from 2026 onwards. And we've been, again, opposing that and explaining the difficulties and reasons to do with that. But there's dialogues going on all the time about lots of issues. We also sent this week evidence on the cost inflation pressures on B&Bs to DCMS, the UK Tourism Department. But this webinar today is about a very hot topic, which is the Scottish Government plans for short-term lets licensing. We'll talk about the background to the short-term lets licensing scheme and the battles we've won and lost, as it were, and bring you up to date with some latest developments. And I'm delighted to announce that my co-panelist today, joining us in a minute, will be Sinclair Williamson, who's a long-standing member of the association, who is the owner of Lochinver Guesthouse in Ayr and chairs the Scottish Guesthouse and B&B Alliance, who've been campaigning on this issue, and others, and are going to be working with us in future on promoting their members. And we work together very well, I think, on advancing the interests of bed and breakfast and guest houses across Scotland. Just a couple of housekeeping issues. You'll see there's a Q&A function where you can enter questions or comments as the webinar goes on. We'll try and answer some, if we can, live during the webinar, and others we may address afterwards on the follow-up. We're going to follow up to everyone who's registered by email. There's also will be follow-up on the webinar page of the Bed and Breakfast Association. This webinar is being recorded, and so will be available to view afterwards on the webinars page of the B&B Association website. So just some background to start off with, because it's important to understand where this all came from and where it started. Way back in 2012, Airbnb started in the UK, and that was a very new issue for us. And the Bed and Breakfast Association immediately started lobbying governments about this, because we saw it as in part an unfair competition issue. We wanted to level the playing field because B&Bs and guest houses were quite rightly inspected and required to comply with fire regulations, gas regulations, food hygiene, all the other things. But yet these competitors to our businesses could start up next door, as it were, and in effect could literally get away with complying with nothing, and nobody was inspecting them and checking them. So it was bad for the consumer, and it was unfair competition for our businesses. So we've been lobbying on that since then, both in the Scottish Government and with the UK Government. Moving forward, Scottish B&B Association gave evidence to the Scottish Parliament in 2017 when they did an inquiry into the effects of the so-called sharing economy, so Airbnb and other platforms. And again, we said what I've just said about the need to level the playing field. And we recommended as a potential way of doing that a registration scheme. And just to explain a bit about registration as opposed to licensing, a registration scheme, which is used in various countries around the world, is a simple system where if you're offering tourist accommodation, you have to register it. You have to simply go to an official government database, give your name and address, contact details, a couple of other details, and say, here am I, I'm offering tourism accommodation to paying guests, and you have to register your name and you get a number. Simple as that. That's what we proposed. It doesn't stop anyone carrying on their business, and it allows the regulators, the fire department, the food hygiene people, anyone else to say, here's the list of everyone offering tourist accommodation, and we can do risk-based checks and just to make sure they're all safe. And so we're all on the same level, operating to the same rules, and that's what we propose. The other way of doing it is licensing, which is what the Scottish Government have chosen and have actually put into legislation. And licensing is much more onerous, much more rigid. It means you have to apply for a license to carry on this trade. And if you don't apply for a license, you're not allowed to trade. And we'll be talking about timings later, but in fact, anyone who wants to start a B&B or a short-term let after 1st of October, so in just over a month's time, won't be allowed to start by law. They won't even be allowed to take a booking until they have a license. So it is quite an onerous thing, licensing, and it's local. So it means that across Scotland, there's 32 different licensing schemes. So lots of consultations went on over the last few years. We were pushing the low-cost, light-touch registration scheme. The government were moving more towards licensing. Unfortunately, lots of things got caught up in the politics in terms of very true and relevant housing issues and housing affordability issues and nuisance of short-term lets in places like Edinburgh and tenement buildings, and lots of things which are very hot topics and very relevant got caught up in it. And unfortunately, I think government tried to solve too many problems at once, and it was what we see as a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Anyway, we ended up with legislation being passed for a licensing scheme, or a set, as I say, of 32 different licensing schemes by every local authority in Scotland. One difficulty of a licensing scheme, if you have a registration scheme, you just have to, everyone who's offering tourism accommodation to paying guests have to be registered. If you have a licensing scheme for short-term lets, the big problem that opens up is you have to define what a short-term let is. Now, we all probably think it's fairly easy, we've got an idea in our minds, but when you, and I've tried it, when you try to write down a definition that's legally watertight, that would include, say, an Airbnb that somebody just decides to offer their property on a platform, but doesn't include a small B&B, for instance, it's very, very difficult to define that in law. So there was a huge problem of what would short-term lets, what it would catch. And we always thought from early stages in these consultations that we as B&Bs, guest houses, wouldn't be included. And the previous tourism minister, Fergus Ewing, didn't seem to think that either. And he said to us on several occasions that he'd never in 21 years or so ever had anyone complain about B&Bs. And he knew where the real issues were. But with the licensing scheme, we're now in the situation where they define short-term lets. And unfortunately, the way they defined it includes B&Bs because they couldn't disentangle it. And originally, in the wording of the legislation, it excluded guest houses, which was class 7. We're going to talk about this in much more detail later. Sinclair will pick this up and talk to it. But there was that wording saying class 7 was excluded. But then it was changed before the law was passed. And it then just talked about hotels that are excluded. So the question of guest houses is a complicated one, which Sinclair will cover more, and we'll come back to that. So that's something, a little bit about the background. We took part, Scottish Bed and Breakfast Association took part in the working group with the Scottish Government on this to try and be constructive as possible in helping make this thing workable, and then try and move it towards less of a licensing scheme, more of a light touch scheme. But we found we weren't being listened to, and back a year ago exactly, more or less, at August last year, we actually resigned from the working group because we felt they weren't listening to us on that. But they've since established a new thing called an industry advisory group on implementation, and we're sitting on that, and Sinclair does too. And we're trying to ensure that the implementation of it is as unonerous as we can possibly make it. But we're left with the fact the Scottish Government have gone for licensing scheme, despite all we've and the others have been saying for the last several years. But we did win some concessions through all this. For instance, last October, the Minister, Shona Robison, made what she called significant and pragmatic changes, referencing the Scottish Bed and Breakfast Association a couple of times in her statement. And she said at that time, revised guidance will be developed with stakeholders with an emphasis on a risk-based, intelligence-led approach to property inspections, and keeping costs and fees under control, and using all the flexibilities in the legislation to facilitate responsible home sharing and bed and breakfast. So they took on board the fact that they didn't want to clobber the bed and breakfast sector, and they wanted to keep fees proportionate. And she listed some things that she'd done after listening to us and others, which included removing powers on over-provision, so-called over-provision, whereby local authorities could say, we think there's too many B&Bs in a particular place, so you're not allowed to open another one. They removed those. They reduced public liability insurance requirement. Previously, they'd had a requirement written into the bill. You had to have £5 million in public liability insurance. We specifically said that we thought that was too prescriptive, and they took on board our request to make it to change that and say you don't have to have 5 million, you have to have adequate public liability insurance. And also in terms of inspections, what they said was where inspections happen in the licensing scheme, they will take into account when they decide who to inspect, things like what they call other accreditation obtained by the host or operator. So whether they're a member of an established trade association, or whether they've won other certification or whatever it might be, that they're less likely to be inspected, which is all sensible and proportionate. Apologies, by the way, if you can hear a leaf blower or something outside this building, which I can hear, but hopefully you can't too much because the microphone, but hopefully it won't interfere. So, and she specifically said that we want to, this is Shona Robison, the Minister, we want to facilitate responsible home sharing, which includes bed and breakfast in somebody's principal home. And Scottish B&B Association have expressed concern about the impact of some of the mandatory conditions in home sharing. So where only some of the rooms are available to guests. So we agree that, for instance, fire safety of furnishings and electrical safety requirements should only apply to rooms that guests use, not every room in the house. Those kind of things they made concessions on. We're not going to get bogged down in today's webinar in huge levels of detail. We want to give you an idea of where this has come from. The fact that we, Sinclair and I and others, have been battling away on your behalf for the last several years on this, trying to fend it off to start with, but also then trying to make it as simple and workable and less expensive as it possibly can be. But so these are some of the things that happened. Use class 7, I said, banning use class 7 originally, in the original wording, they said it was excluded. I'll leave that for Sinclair to cover in a minute, so there's no point in us duplicating each other, but I'll maybe come back afterwards and pick up any relevant questions that you may have on this. Just want to quickly mention key dates. From 1st of October, so in about a month from now, all new operators of short-term lets must apply for a license. And it says they must not accept bookings or receive guests until their license has been granted. So as I said at the beginning, this is very onerous. You can't even take a booking hoping you will have a license by then. If you're new, if you're starting your business after 1st of October, if you're already up and running by then, like as I guess most of you watching this will be, that's different. So the next date is by the 1st of April, 1st of April 2023, all existing operators of short-term lets, so including B&Bs, must have applied for a license for each of their premises. Existing operators are allowed to stay open until their license application has been determined. And then from 1st of July next year, 1st of July, sorry, 2024, all short-term operators must have a license. So those are the key dates. Sinclair will talk about types of license in a minute. But those are the key things. One exclusion to mention briefly is alcohol licensing. If you have an alcohol license for your premises, you're excluded from the short-term lets because you've already been through a process. So, for instance, we had an email query from this morning from Sarah, who says we own an inn, a bar, eatery, takeaway, and guest rooms. We feel we do not come under the short-term lets licensing rules. Do we, or are we exempt? Well, Sarah, as far as we can tell from what you're saying, that you are excluded from them, because if you own an inn with rooms and that those premises are all the same premises and you have a license for alcohol, then you're clearly excluded. The problem would be if you have slightly separate properties, even if they're adjoining and they have different planning classes, then that might be difficult. But I'm assuming your one property, an inn or a pub, effectively in with rooms, you're licensed for alcohol. No, you're not included. You can forget the short-term lets because it's excluded. So those are so that's one of the exclusions which is relevant, because some people may feel I want an alcohol license anyway. I found when I was a B&B owner that it was useful for us for extra profit to have an alcohol license, and it was worth doing. So, and you exclude yourself from this. Having said that, in terms of the timing, now there's very little in it, so there's not much chance to get an alcohol license very quickly, and it won't save you a lot. But it may be that if you wanted to have an alcohol license anyway, you can go through that process, and then you won't have to do both if you have the alcohol license in time. I'll pick up some of the questions that are coming in a minute, but I think I've spoken enough at the moment, so I'll pass over to Sinclair, who will introduce himself again and cover the use class 7 issue and the license types and other things. So over to you, Sinclair. Thank you.
David, and thank you for the background information, which I hope everybody will find helpful. Yeah, I'm Sinclair Williamson, as David said, and I chair the Scottish Guesthouse and B&B Alliance. Now, this was formed at the beginning of 2021, a few months into the pandemic, after we had gone through a lockdown situation, and we were formed really out of a group of we were local B&B associations, small local groups who came together. So our committee is made up of people like myself who all run bed and breakfasts or guest houses, and we're all volunteers. So we do the best we can, but we're obviously limited with our resources as volunteers. But as David said, I'm also a member of the Scottish Bed and Breakfast Association and have been for many years, which has been really helpful. So I'm familiar with all the work that David's been doing over the years in the lead up to the short-term legislation. So the Scottish Guesthouse and B&B Alliance really started to lobby the government on issues like grant support for guest houses and bed and breakfasts. And then, of course, it became apparent as we got into 2021 and 2022 that bed and breakfasts and guest houses were actually going to be included within the scope of the legislation. And so we have been lobbying the government on this as well. We were actually hoping that bed and breakfasts and guest houses could be taken out of the legislation, but of course it's gone through Parliament now, and it is what we are where we are with it now. So it's quite a complex situation, really. But there were several changes made to the legislation throughout, you know, from the first draft of the legislation to the final draft that went through Parliament. There were several changes and amendments, and I think this is partly what's led to the final document being very confusing and contradictory in the way it's been written, and so it's led to lots of issues. But to be clear, there are three different groups of accommodation types that are affected. There are self-catering properties, bed and breakfasts, and guest houses. Now, on top of that, the legislation itself is a big subject. We've only got an hour here to cover everything, so we're going to focus our attention on bed and breakfast and guest houses. So they're the members of the Scottish Bed and Breakfast Association and the Scottish Guesthouse and B&B Alliance, yourselves basically. But we are aware that some of you will also have self-catering properties, so we'll kind of cover things that are relevant to you. As far as the legislation goes, it passed through the Parliament in January 2022, and all 32 local authorities within Scotland are now required to implement a short-term licensing scheme and to have that established by the 1st of October, as David said. So it's only 1 month away. If you already run a bed and breakfast or guest house that's in a domestic dwelling, so that's class 9, then you will have to apply for a license. Now, I'm just going to share my screen because this has got a definition of class 9. So the local authorities use a class system. So each type of building is put into a class. So a domestic house, that, you know, a flat or a house or somewhere that's somebody's main residence, is class 9. There's different classes, you know, there's classes 1 to I think 12. I can't remember the total number, but you know, there's a classification for shops, for example. And then the two that we're interested in is class 9, which is a house. Now, many bed and breakfasts and guest houses are in class 9. There are some, you can see if you look at the bottom of the screen here, B, class 9B, as a bed and breakfast establishment or guest house where at any one time not more than 2 bedrooms are, or in the case of premises having less than 4 bedrooms, 1 bedroom is used for that purpose. Now, we know that there are some bed and breakfast and guest house businesses that have evolved from that. So there may be some of you who are operating under class 9 who are much larger than that now. And of course, some local authorities have said that this is okay and others haven't. So it's a complicated picture. But if you are within that class, if you're class 9, essentially you'll be paying council tax on all of your property, then you are within the scope of the licensing scheme and you will have to apply for a license. Now, if you run a self-catering property, there isn't actually a class specific for self-catering. So you may have a house that's a class 9 house that you rent out as a self-catering property. You will have to apply for a license for that. You may have a house or a building, I should say, that's a class 7 property. Now that would have been a hotel or a hostel or a boarding house or a guest house at some point. Now, officially that should be, if you have a class 7 property that you're running as a self-catering property, that should have required planning permission, and you would be put into a new class, a different class, which is called sui generis, and it just means a class of its own, essentially. So if something was class 7 and you're running it as a self-catering, then that's what it should be. And you will be required to have a license, apply for a license for that. So just because it was a class 7 property doesn't mean anything. If it's self-catering, you will have to apply for a license. If, on the other hand, you're in a B&B or guest house in a building that's classified as use class 7, which I will show you next, if I can. Here we are, class 7. So this is the class system again, and this is the definition of class 7. So use as a hotel, boarding house, guest house, or hostel, where no significant element of care is provided, other than a premises license for sale of alcohol, liquor to persons other than residents, or to persons other than persons consuming meals on the premises, and other than a use within class 9 houses. So essentially, licensed hotels and unlicensed hotels, and also licensed guest houses and unlicensed guest houses will fall into class 7. Now, you will have, at some point, somebody will have had to apply for planning permission to be within this class. And if you're a larger guest house with more than 2 bedrooms let out, as you know, as we talked about in the class 9 definition, then you should have applied for class 7 to become a guest house under class 7. Now, if you've done that, you will be paying non-domestic rates. So it's a business premises. And this is where it's complicated, because the government have said in the licensing order, the short-term let licensing order, that hotels are excluded. So that's hotels within this class. They do not mention guest houses. They did originally have guest houses listed in here, but they removed them from the text. They also removed reference to class 7. But the problem is, so the housing department, who were responsible for the order, have said that guest houses are included in the licensing scheme. However, it's not as clear as that, because hotels use this local authorities use this class system to know what sort of premises you are. And so we have written to all 32 local authorities for clarification on whether guest houses and bed and breakfasts within class 7 are included within the scope of the license. We've had a response from 6 of these local authorities so far, and all 6 of them have said that guest houses are excluded. Class 7 businesses are excluded. So if you have a premises that's class 7, they're saying you're excluded. We haven't heard back from most of the other local authorities. So presumably this is because they're unclear on how to square this up with what the government says, with what the classification system says. So there's an anomaly there, and we're trying to resolve this, but it's been an issue that's been going on for months now. We have been in contact with the government in various different departments, and we've been in contact with local authorities. And we're only 1 month away, and yet still this has not been cleared. So at the moment, some local authorities are saying that you do not need to apply for a license, while the government are saying that you do. So this is something that needs to be cleared up. Now, what we are going to ask you to do is to write to your local authority and seek clarification. If you're a class 7 business, seek clarification from them on whether or not you're included within the scope, because you are a class 7 business and class 7 hotels are excluded. Now, we do know from what we have heard back from some of the local authorities that there is no difference between a hotel or guest house in class 7. That planning permission is not required to change from a class 7 guest house to a class 7 hotel. So we would ask you to write to your local authority for clarification. I think it's important that as many people as possible write, so we can be clear on this. And if more local authorities respond to you, we would also ask that you share that information with myself and David. If you're a member of one or other, or possibly both organisations, please do let us know, because it's important that we know what the most up-to-date situation is as well.
Sinclair,
Yeah.
So sorry, just to add, thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No,
yeah, I mean, when people are writing, just to mention as well, to ask them, it's a good thing to ask them what the fees are that they're going to charge you, because not all of them have, only a few, I think, have announced their level of fees. And this is obviously a very, very important issue. And we heard all sorts of stories about fees being many hundreds of pounds early on. Some of them may have been scare stories, but we were very insistent that having proportionate fees is very important, because some of these businesses are very, very tiny. And so I think we've heard of one that's about 200 and 250 pounds. But people need to ask each local authority what fees they're going to charge and how they go about the application process, mustn't they?
Yeah, that's a good point, David, really. I think local authorities should be publishing this by the 1st of October, but it's not always widely available, unless you know exactly where to look. So I think that is a really good question to ask.
And sorry, as you were saying, this last minute change of wording, which is now in the law, which the exclusion literally reads, and this is a quote, what is excluded is, quote, a hotel which has planning permission granted for use as a hotel. Well, that's actually, it sounds good, it sounds understandable in English, but it's actually meaningless in planning terms, because there is no planning class that is only hotels and nothing else. As you can see from that wording on the screen and what Sinclair just said, class 7 is hotels, boarding houses, guest houses, etc., etc. So our natural inclination was to say, well, the only possible way you can interpret that is to say class 7 is excluded. But the oddity is that that's what it previously said, and they deliberately changed it. So we've been pressing for clarification on this, as Sinclair said, and it's interesting that the only 6 local authorities have all agreed with us that have said anything so far. But also, both Sinclair and I were in a meeting yesterday of the industry advisory group, and we were told that the Scottish Government is going to issue a clarification to us, and we asked when, and we were told possibly within days, possibly soon. This is all very, very, very late, because we're right up against the date when it starts, which is about a month away now. Yeah,
it's really unsatisfactory, but yeah, this is the problem we have, and we're working really hard behind the scenes constantly to try and get clarification on this. Just to bring you some more information, which some of you may have seen if you're part of the Scottish Guesthouse and B&B Alliance Facebook group. One of our members wrote to John Swinney, because he is their MSP, the Deputy First Minister, and he clarified that premises that have planning consent to operate as a hotel are excluded from the scheme. Guest houses are exempt if the premises have planning consent under Class Order 7. They are not determined as a short let property. Now that matches what the 6 local authorities have already confirmed to us. So really, our next step is to press the planning department within the government for clarification, because there are different departments within government, and it's not clear. My personal feeling is that perhaps at an early stage, when the legislation was being drafted, planning would have been involved, the planning team in the government would have been involved in this, but the licensing order has come through from the housing team, and it may be that the changes that have happened over the various drafts that brought us to where we're at now, that maybe that planning weren't involved in the later stages, and this may be why we have this issue at the moment. So we're going to press for that information from the planning team and try and encourage them to have some dialogue with the housing team, if that's not already happened. So just to recap, self-catering properties will need to apply for a license regardless of which class you're in. Class 9 properties and domestic dwelling, which is paying council tax for both the property, will require to apply for a license. Class 7 guest houses, we are advising you to write to your local authorities and ask whether you are exempt from the licensing scheme because your business is class 7. I should point out that, you know, as a class 7 property, it is a business premise, it's not a house. You know, you probably have part of your property, if you live in part of the property, you'll be paying council tax on that part, and that is your home. The other part of the building is a commercial premises, and as such, there, you know, there's a distinction there. Now, moving on, if you hopefully you can see that that slide properly.
Yes.
See the top, okay. But there are 4 types of license you can apply for, and it would appear to be quite obvious in the first instance. If you are a council tax paying class 9 bed and breakfast or guest house, then the license you should be applying for is home sharing, because it is a home that you're sharing with other people. If you are renting out your property to for self-catering, for example, and it's you don't live in there yourself, sorry, you do live in there yourself, but you're renting out part of the property to guests, or you're perhaps away for some of the year, you go on holiday and you let out your property while you're away. This is home letting. So that would be the license you'd apply for there. If you have a second home and it's, you know, it's not your property, or you maybe have multiple self-catering properties that you rent out, but they're not where you live, then that is secondary letting license. And then, of course, the last one is home sharing and home letting, where you're doing a bit of each, where perhaps you're doing bed and breakfast, and then maybe for 6 months of the year, perhaps you could be doing bed and breakfast in your home, and then you maybe go away and you rent out all of your home when you're away. So as a self-catering let. So those are the 4 types. Now, if you're a guest house and you're class 7, it would appear unlikely that you'd fit into any of these 4 license types, because I think the government have assumed that it should be home sharing. But because a class 7 property is a commercial property, you know, you're paying non-domestic rates, you are paying commercial rates for your gas and electricity, commercial tariffs, you'll be paying commercial, you'll have a commercial contract for your water supply and sewage, you'll probably have commercial waste contracts and all these sorts of things. So really, it cannot be described as home sharing. Possibly it could fit into secondary letting, but you know, by the example they've given for secondary letting, that implies it's a whole house let. It's like a second home. So it's not a home that you're letting, it's a commercial business. And I think this is where the fact that guest houses at the last minute have been included in the legislation, it doesn't seem to have been thought through properly. And so just be mindful of all of these things. And this is why, again, we can't stress enough that it's important you write to your local authority now, because there's only 1 month to go. And ideally, we wouldn't want any of the businesses here involved in having to be involved in this onerous legislation, licensing scheme, sorry. But class 9 properties are included, self-catering properties are included. It is only class 7. And so there is some hope that class 7 businesses will be excluded. And as I say, if you write to your local authority, you need clarity as much as anybody else. And so that's what we would do. And we'd ask that you let us know as well. I think if you're an established business, you've got between October and the 1st of April 2023 to apply for the license. Obviously, you want to get that underway as soon as possible, because there's, you know, there will be delays. The councils are working through a lot of different things at the moment to do with this. So there are some useful links here now. These will be shared with you afterwards. So don't worry if you don't get a chance to write this down. You can view this webinar later, as David said, and I think he's going to send out these slides as well. So there's a couple of links here which you can look at. You can type them in and look at them. The government advice is all here. So page 1's the introduction. There are several pages you want to read through, but the one that you may want to look at more closely is page 9, because this one has a checklist of things that you need to attend to before you apply for a license. So it's making sure you have the right type of insurance in place, making sure that you have your energy, your electrical certificates and everything else in place. So if you're a class 7 business, you will probably have all these things in place anyway, because you'll have been required to have done that as a commercial property. You may not have them in place, so it's important that you have all your ducks lined up with this before you apply for your license. So that's a really useful link for you there. If you've got any other queries or questions, we'll try and address those today. That's kind of all I want to say. There's probably the other things that will come up in questions, but that's probably all I want to say for now. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen just now. You will get copies of these afterwards.
Thanks very much, Sinclair. That's great. And yes, just to say, we're going to, as I said at the beginning, this is being recorded. It'll be available to view later on the webinars page on the B&B Association website, where most of you or many of you went to actually register for this. We'll put those 2 links that Sinclair just shared there as well, or the links to the main things, that the Scottish Government official guidance for hosts and the official guidance for local authorities. The host link will go to the whole thing. Sinclair just was highlighting page 9 of it as being a particularly important one, but that's the official guidance that's there. We'll also put the link, which is a useful one, we've shared with members already, there's an information hub that Visit Scotland have put up about this whole thing. They involved us in the industry advisory group on putting it together, and it's a useful sort of information hub for hosts and operators. And again, the link to that will be under the webinar when you can view it later on our webinars page. There's a few questions coming through. A few of them are really on the lines of, how do I know contact details at my local authority, who's in charge of this, and how do I find out how to make an application? The thing is, it's your local authority that is responsible for this. It'll be their licensing team probably, and there should be something on their website. It's worth looking now. It may not be up now because they don't have to have started the scheme till the 1st of October, but they certainly should have ideally got something on their website already, because we're not far away. But do go and look at their your local authority's website, see if you can see anything about where the licensing information is. If you've got any queries, maybe try the general inquiries thing of where do I find who's responsible for licensing, because I believe I'm a short-term let. So they're responsible for doing that, and they should be there to help you, and they should certainly be able to explain exactly what it's going to cost in your area and how to go about that process.
Can I just come in there, David? Just in terms of who you contact, we've got a list of the licensing email addresses, which I'd be happy to share. We could perhaps put them on a note that we can circulate.
Thank you. Yes, if you can, yeah, share. We'll share that then.
And contact,
yeah, and we can certainly email all the people who registered for this webinar, and we could include that if we've got that together, or somehow get it to our individual memberships. And it goes without saying, we'll try and keep our members fully informed on all of this as it goes forward, and then when we've got any more news on anything. But yeah, people. Somebody asked about HMOs. I'm actually not totally sure about what the answer to that is. If you're an HMO operator,
I think David, that with the HMO, I think because it depends whether they are the people are living there or not. The people who are, if it's a house of multiple occupancy, if that's a principal home, they wouldn't have to apply for a license. It's just if it's short-term letting, that it would be relevant, I think.
Yes, that sounds like that sounds right to me. Somebody else, another Sarah, asked, we have a guest house with a detached self-catering cottage in the garden. Do you think we'll need 2 licenses or just the one, as it's the same property? It's probably difficult for us to give a definitive view because it all depends on how your local authority is going to interpret all these things. If it's completely 2 detached separate buildings, they may well say you need 2 different licenses, but one would hope that they would take a more sensible view and say if it's all one sort of business, as it were, just require one. But I mean, I don't think we can necessarily, well, we could give you an answer, but it wouldn't necessarily be the same one as your local authority would give you. So yeah, it wouldn't be definitive. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Sinclair.
No, I mean, it's more clear cut if you've got 2, say you had 2 self-catering properties, and they're the same postcode in the same, on the same site, then that's different. There would be 1 license for that. But because it's a guest house, it's 2 different types of business in a way. Because of the one is class 7 and the self-catering property, I don't know what that would require a license because it's sui generis, or it may be class 9. So really, this is something that's a question really that would have to be directed to your local authority, and you would hope they would be generous and allow you to have 1 license to cover both. But it's not clear cut from the information that I have. But it's possible that you may require 2 licenses. Again, it depends whether your guest house is class 9 or class 7, whether that would require a license. And so again, this is really important because you are a guest house. If you're class 7, please do write to your local authority. But in this case, I would write anyway because it's an unusual situation.
Okay, thank you. We've had another a question from Andy. He says, would it be possible to have a wording clause template for insertion into our T&Cs to incorporate the short-term lets requirements to safeguard against being unable to trade after 1st of July 2024 and then being subjected to punitive cancellation charges from OTAs for bookings you're forced to cancel? That opens up a whole can of worms. It's good to read that question because you can see that there, and this is one of the things we've raised and others have been raising over the last 2-3 years, that once you have a licensing scheme, you're giving a very onerous bit of uncertainty and worry to the businesses, because you're an established business, you're carrying on that business as a guest house or B&B, and yet you've now got to apply for a license for the future. If that license in future was turned down, you then will be in a position where you've got to cancel everybody's bookings and refund all their money. And basically your business would have been in effect closed by the licensing authority. This raises sort of issues with insurance and things, and even finance. How are businesses like B&Bs, guest houses going to get finance when they've got this hanging over them? We don't know the answer to this. We've raised this as an issue, and online travel agents, as everyone knows, if something goes wrong that they've caused, they tend to want you to help. If something goes wrong that you've caused, they tend to be very inflexible about it, and you can imagine they'll be very punitive if you have to cancel future bookings. So it's a very good point. We will look. We, Scottish Bed and Breakfast Association, will look at whether we can recommend wording for T&Cs. We always have problems with this in the past because lawyers tell us, "Oh, you've got to be careful what you recommend people to say because it may give you liability." But we'll see what we can do to help on that. So it's a good point. So thank you for raising that, Andy, and we'll look to see if we can recommend a wording. But it certainly is something everyone needs to think about and be aware of, because there is a chance that an application could be turned down. I mean, to reassure people, because we don't want to spread doom and gloom unnecessarily, I think it'd be extremely unlikely. And if you're running a good business and you're well established, I just think it'd be vanishingly unlikely that you would be have your license turned down. So don't sort of think you're going to be closed down. But it is theoretically possible, because you will have to legally have a license in order to carry on this business that you're already in.
Yeah.
So
there's something else that I think it's important just to add to that to make sure you get your license, because as David said, it's highly unlikely you will be turned down if you're running a well-run established business. Just make sure that you use the checklist and you make sure that you are complying with everything on the checklist before you submit your application. That will sort out any problems before they arise. So you know, what you don't want to do is to be submitting an application and then you find, oh, we haven't got the right type of insurance in place, or we haven't got. So just go through all of that and all the checklist. Make sure you dot the I's and cross the T's, and have everything ready before you put in your application, so that there's less likelihood of issues, because local authorities will be processing lots of these applications. They're unlikely to go into details. If you're ticking all the boxes, they will probably just, you know, pass it and that should be that. But you know, there is obviously no guarantees, but you know, that will help smooth the way if you make sure you attend to everything. I see there's a question come in about Malcolm from Inverness is saying, is there any visibility on timing of when we will get the local details? We're based in Inverness. Well, we've talked about that. It's from the 1st of October to the 23rd of, sorry, the 1st of October to the 1st of April that you have to apply for the license. The information will be up by the 1st of October. Is it worth getting an alcohol license rather than a short-term let license? Well, interestingly, the meeting that David and I attended yesterday, we learned something about this. If you have an alcohol license, then you're exempt. However, the timing now, we've only got 1 month now until the 1st of October. You will have had to have had your alcohol license in place by then before you can be exempt. So it's probably a bit late in the day to apply for a license now. It's not impossible. Some local authorities are very quick in the whole process, but it's probably unlikely. I would suggest you have a discussion, if you're thinking about going down that route, have a discussion with your licensing authority to understand the process in your area and to understand when they meet and you know, all the different stages involved and the timing involved, because you would have to start now really, and the chances are it's probably unlikely you would get your alcohol license in time for the 1st of October. Yes, although if you're running an existing business, you have between October and April, don't you, to apply? For the short-term let license, yes. Yes. So although we wouldn't advise people to wait till the last minute, because that's going to be too risky, as Sinclair said earlier, it's best to apply as early as you can. You don't actually have to apply on the 1st of October. But we have had a question from Hayley, who says, I'm mid-purchase for a 2-bedroom B&B. When will I need to start the application process? As we're taking over a business, will we have until April? We're due to complete on the 7th of November. Well, as I understand it, you're taking over an existing B&B business. That business would have until, or the premises owner would have until 1st of April next year to apply. So once you take over the business in early November, you'd be best advised to start the application process straight away, Hayley. But you have until April at the latest to apply. Yeah. Sorry. Is that right, Sinclair? I mean, no, absolutely fine. Yeah. We're both. You see, we're both fairly steeped in all this, but nobody knows for certain the results definitively. That's why we're being very careful what we can say, because it's all to what your individual local authority will interpret the rules as, and that is by no means set in stone necessarily. Yeah. That's why we're trying to
to firm up a lot of these
Yeah.
definitions and clarify things.
So I'm just looking at another question that's here. How do you find out if you're a Class 7 guest house? Well, that's interesting. You could have a look at the planning records, which will be online for your property, and they'll go back. I don't know when they switched to online, probably in the last 20 years. If there's nothing on there, if you were paying if you're registered for non-domestic rates, you're probably Class 7, but not guaranteed. There are some anomalies. You could contact your local authority. Now, if I think if you have been operating as a guest house for at least 10 years, you probably have some, do you have some grandfather rights, David? I don't know if you know any more about that.
I don't know legally, Sinclair. I think you'd be in a much better position, but I don't know if legally what the situation is.
Yeah, you can contact your local authority and ask, for confirmation that you're Class 7. Explain that if you are paying non-domestic, if you are registered for non-domestic rates, and explain how long your business has been in operation. We should be able to clarify that for you. You could perhaps ask for a letter of comfort to clarify that you are indeed Class 7, that you have been operating as a non-domestic rated commercial business for X number of years, and see what they come back with, and tell them the you want to know as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Sinclair. I think I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I think we are getting towards the end, and we'll have to finish in a second. As you can see, it's a massive subject, and we could probably have carried on for hours. I've got just one more question. It's probably worth touching on. Gordon has asked, is it worth covering any differences which might apply if your business is within a short-term let control area? Well, I think that's outside the sort of remit of this webinar today, apart from just to mention this fact that there's a whole different dimension we haven't talked about today, which is short-term let control areas, which are add another level of complexity and control and planning. So you need to know if you are in a control area. If you're in Edinburgh, for instance, you are, there'll be other control areas sort of brought in. That we haven't got time to discuss that now, other than it's worth knowing that this is an issue, because it's not just the licensing. There's the control areas where the individual local authorities can define an area or a city and designate it as an area which they can apply different criteria to controlling short-term lets in that area. So it's worth mentioning it, but we haven't got time to go into it. So I think, thank you for all your questions. We've answered a few of the key ones here today during the webinar. We'll try and pick up any questions we haven't answered, because we'll have them all in writing, and see if we can answer them in other ways. Well, as I say, we'll follow up by email if you've registered to this, and members will receive much more information as time goes on anyway. So thank you to everyone. Thank you very much to Sinclair for your time this morning as well, and all the work that you've done. And I hope everyone's found this webinar useful. Do send us comments, so help us to improve for future webinars. And good luck with everyone for this rest of this season, and with navigating the short-term lets application process and licensing to you all. So don't forget, we're all here to help you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.